Good evening, good evening, Hope Biblical Scholars. Blessings unto you all. Blessings unto our Dean of Studies, Apostle Simon Cross Smith. I truly pray that you all are being blessed and elevated in your studies as we have been going through the courses of Esther, Sarah, and Ruth, Rose, opposition, challenges, yielding. There has been so much that we have been learning from these powerful women of God. So I truly pray you have been encouraged. Tonight, we are going to talk about opposition. And Esther has a lot to teach us tonight on opposition. So I am going to yield myself to the Holy Spirit, to Esther, to bring forth the teaching. So when we look at our objective, the objective of tonight is we are going to examine opposition in its usefulness in creating an opportune time for one to rise in potential purpose. And immediately this can sound like, well, wait a minute, opposition, usefulness, that sounds like a contradiction. But we're going to see how it supports purpose and the movement of purpose. And I'm just going to give some definitions, and I'm going to start with the definition of opportune time. So, an opportune time is something that is suitable or convenient for a particular occurrence. And it is also something occurring at an appropriate time. Opposition is hostile or contrary action or condition, something that opposes. And opposes means to offer resistance to. So again, opposition creates an opportune time, something that's hostile. How can that create an opportune time? Well, something that Esther, when we read Esther's story, that we can see right from the very beginning is opposition is woven into the narrative. Opposition is something that it can't be avoided. You can't pass it. You can't go up and around it, right? It is woven into the narrative. It is a very intricate part of her narrative as well, because we learn in the challenges that a lot of what we were seeing, and even the Rose course, it had everything. It had a lot to do with the co-laboring relationship that she was in. So we're going to examine, there are three focal points of opposition that we're going to examine tonight, which is going to be internal opposition, external opposition, and cultural opposition that we see that Esther had to process and she had to rise in. And to lay the foundation of the importance of now us as we elevate in our perspective of opposition is because the misunderstanding of opposition can have such a detrimental effect to one's purpose, because if there's a misunderstanding of that usefulness and how it's created and how it's actually a part of the story, one thing that it could cause one to do is begin to question, well, am I in authority? Am I a woman of purpose? Am I in alignment? Why are these things happening? And it can begin to cause one to chip away or come out of alignment with their authority. Because when we read and as we're going to look into the account of Esther, you see that the opposition is actually the truth of it is it was showing and it was pinpointing and highlighting that one actually was standing in their purpose. There was a purpose that actually was moving in their life. And that is why the opposition had to happen. And again, just to reiterate, that misunderstanding the effects, because there's a word that I want to share with you all, which is called abdicate. A misunderstanding of opposition in one's purpose narrative could cause one to abdicate their authority. And abdicate means to renounce a throne or the office, a high office, or function. Because we learn about the roles, position, function. So a misunderstanding when opposition begins to rise in one's life, if it's not seen in the correct perspective of purpose, it could cause you to give up your actual place of authority. So I wanted to set that stage because now when we start to look at Esther's life, and you don't have to go to Esther chapter 2, but I do want you to turn to Esther chapter 4 because that's where we're going to spend some time in. And I'm going to read in the NIV version tonight. But just the background of Esther 2, when I say, we begin to see her story, she's already placed in a position of opposition, one that was creating a stage of why her role and position would even matter, that mantle that she had to pick up. Because there was an opposition that was happening with the king and the original queen. Because in that account, it says he was angry. There was a hostile situation that was happening. And that led to the decree and the call to go out to find somebody who could soothe the king's anger, who could soothe this place of opposition. There was something that was hostile that was happening. So a call went out. And we learned in the roles course, Esther was already placed in that position to answer the call, to respond to this opposition that was happening. That was a part of her narrative. But when we go to chapter 4, we're going to see now how this opposition became more intimate. Now it's her. It has come to her. So we're going to take our time through it. And again, remember the focal points is going to be internal opposition, external opposition, and cultural opposition. That's the view that I want us to have as we're reading through this account. Now, by the time we get to chapter 4, this is when that external opposition has come to her. Now, what was the external hostile situation that was happening? Haman has sent out a decree, not only against Mordecai, but against now an entire group of people, against the Jewish nation. There was a decree essentially of genocide that went out. So now imagine you're in your role, whatever role Father has you in, and there are, because we are still the bride of Christ, right? Let's remember, still looking at it in the spiritual way as well. We're still part of the bride of Christ. So there is war that happens, right? There are external situations that are going on in this life. The grand co-laboring relationship that we have is with Yahweh and with Yeshua. So there are external oppositions that arise that that we are all useful for in our potential purpose to respond to, that we can be called upon, however that may look, whatever your role, position, functions on your job, in your family, in the privacy of your own home, because we learned about intercessory and prayer. So with that, here Esther is in her role, her function, and an external opposition comes directly to her. And when this external opposition comes to her, because she's in her co-laboring relationship with Mordecai, we're going to see how it begins to expose internal opposition that Esther had to deal with within herself. So let's start reading. And I'm starting right at verse 1 in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In the province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Keep that sentence in mind. When this decree went out, everyone who was Jewish, their response was fasting, weeping, wailing, because that was a customary thing, right? Put on sackcloth and ashes for the Jewish people. When Esther, eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So let's pause right there. Esther is a Jewish woman, right? She's a Jewish woman. She is the queen. When she got news of what happened, her initial response was, I need him to put some clothes on because I need to come and talk to him. However, we see a cultural opposition happen this because that was a cultural conflict. And a decree and genocide went out. So the response was weeping, fasting, and mourning. But Esther responded out of what was the cultural indoctrination, and that's a word to hold on to. There was a cultural indoctrination that happened because now she's sending for him to put clothes on. Why? Because the law of the land was you can't just come through the king gate. However, the Jews were in weeping and mourning and fasting. It says, then Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Now, the immediate response or the immediate highlight in this, Mordecai understood, because again, remember, he had that position with the king. So he knew what was the law of the land too. And I'm sure he knew, okay, the law of the land wasn't can't nobody just go into the king, but that's not where he's at. His thought is, your role, your function, you carry your favor, you're co-laboring here with me. I'm calling upon now because I know what's inside of you. So now I'm calling upon what is inside of you and what is that purpose. That's what I'm going to speak to. I'm not speaking to anything else. And keep that. I'm not speaking to anything else. He's like, I'm only going to speak to what I know is your function right now. Now, when Hafsa went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai has said, this is now where we see Esther is faced with an internal opposition and a cultural opposition at the same time. Because her response was, then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials, Mordecai was the king official, all the king officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days has passed since I was called to go to the king. This is where we hear that Esther in this moment wasn't responding out of the place of authority that she was in, but what was happening is she began to respond out of indoctrination. And that is how we see internal opposition and how it serves the purpose. Because now this is the time where Esther has to confront herself. There's going to be some self-confrontation that needs to occur. And again, why is this a good thing that this opposition happens and why it comes? Well, because internal opposition, and when we have those moments of self-confrontation, it's there to push you further into your purpose, not away. And that's where we, as scholars, having that refined perspective is because it has that understanding where, like, sometimes one could maybe experience something. You could be if you've ever find yourself saying like, oh well, I've walked with God for this long, and then why suddenly do it seem like this particular thing is something that's like a challenge, or that now he's talking to me about, or I've been a mom for so many years, but now all of a sudden this seems to be something that's happening. And we can at times have a perspective that when opposition comes, that we must be in error, that something must be wrong, or that I shouldn't be dealing with this because, and then we try to fill in that blank. But in this particular situation and in this narrative, as it pertains to purpose, no opposition had to come, because I need to let you know that there is something internally hostile against your purpose. So I need it going. I can't let you keep moving in purpose or staying there. Or again, even just the peace and grace, you ain't know because I ain't talked to you about it before. It wasn't relevant until now. Again, opportune time. That's the part. This opposition came because it's now relevant for me to talk to you about this internal thing that's hostile, because there is an external resolve that I need you in position for. So now we going to talk about it, because the what it's doing is going to push you to rise in your purpose right now. It's going to push you into alignment. And that's what we see. I'm a little excited not to get too happy, but we're going to see how that it really does push Esther more and more and more into her purpose as we read the rest of her account. But again, right here, we see that indoctrination, which is also a cultural opposition, because Esther was a Jewish woman who was living and essentially raised in a land that was completely different than what would have been the Jewish heritage, right? It would have been completely different than what was the Jewish what was known to them. So an example of that could be is, again, you may be positioned in like, your family or at a school or a situation where everything doesn't necessarily align to what or what you're taught of, about God and your relationship. But the thing in that is then, we don't get indoctrinated by the culture. Father, because Father still had his people in this land is something to put emphasis on too. Remember, the Jewish people settled in the land of Susa. So there was still his people here. So it wasn't off that Esther was in here, but it wasn't meant for her to become indoctrinated. So when she was called upon in this moment, her initial response, how she initially began to speak, was out of indoctrination. And that is now where, as we look, that had to have some confrontation. So when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this, for such a time as the external opposition, and for such a time as for this internal opposition, because I need you to align in purpose. And the emphasis where he says, if you remain silent. So looking at that scripture where he says, if you remain silent, because we do know that there was a time in Esther's life where there had to be a hiding and a concealing of part of her identity, right? That directly could correlated with her purpose. However, just because it was hidden or dormant didn't mean it was dead. And it also didn't mean that it was forever. It just meant there was a time for this thing to be concealed. So now that time of silence is over. That that time of silence then was over. Now I need you to speak. Now I need you. So now that's the part where we can see the potential of that internal conflict that Esther had to immediately shift in. Well, wait a minute. I was so used to a former thing. I was so used to one way of doing something. This how y'all told me to do it. I've been doing it this way. I've been so used to maybe being silent or maybe functioning in my position in other ways. Okay, I had the function as a queen down pat. I had the functioning in beauty down pat. I had that. That was going for me. But now, oh, I gotta speak. Hold up. Speak when culturally as a woman, no, I'm not supposed to do that. And then as a queen, even though I'm a queen, I can't just walk in front of this king. So now all at once there's this internal conflict that has to happen where Esther has to face herself and say, well, I can't hold on to what may have been culturally indoctrinated. I can't hold on to certain core beliefs that I may have developed. I can't hold on to a perspective that I may have had up until this point in time. I can't even hold on to the fact that, I mean, I had this one part of my purpose. I thought I was doing real good in that, but now you're telling me I got to activate in another part. I got to rise in another part. So all of that is this confrontation. And the thing about this co-laboring relationship is Mordecai, again, when he spoke, he was not speaking to the beliefs, the indoctrination. He wasn't speaking to any of that. What he continued to speak to was who he knew she was and where she was put at and what he was calling for and what needed to happen. And the beauty of that, because we can see Father do that in our life, you know, we may have people that are put in our lives that are speak, right? To not to pacify a thing, but they're going to speak to the purpose. And the reason why that's beautiful is because in the midst of that opposition, it allowed Esther the strength to now begin to rise and to begin to practice in that place that she had to rise in. Because one thing that I just love, like when you're looking in the Bible, to me, you know, as I was studying, you see this space between verse 14 and verse 15, right? It's a space here. Now we're taught there are mysteries in the Bible. So to me, this space, it was like that was that moment where self-confrontation was beginning to happen with Esther. Because the very next thing that she says is, right, we just heard her speak out of indoctrination. But now by verse 15, it says, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. She went right to fasting. It wasn't no more, oh, we're not supposed to do this because that's not the law of the land. It was, oh, okay. Okay, well, go get them and then go fast. And then don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do, because now I'm a fast too. She didn't even leave herself out. She didn't just put it on Mordecai and the Jews. She said, okay, well, I'm letting go of what may have been the culture I was placed in, but now I got to remember the purpose. I got to remember my identity, though, and why I was put in this foreign land. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fast as you do. And when this is done, I'm going to go to the king. Now, when this fasting is done, I'm going to go to the king, even though it's against the law. So she recognized it was a cultural hostility, but she said, I don't care no more. I'm going to fast with y'all. And when we done, I'm going to go to the king. And if I perish, I perish. And an important understanding of how this was such a conflict for Esther of making this statement, if I perish, I perish, is because it is to note that on either side, she truly did face death. If she didn't say anything, there was a genocide that went out for the Jewish people. So she would be killed. Or I'm going to go against the law of this land and I'm going to go against the culture, and then I could possibly die over there too. So which one I'm going to choose? If I perish, I perish. Well, I at least might as well go ahead and choose the one that I was positioned for. Because I wasn't positioned, and my function is not to be silent. My function is not to be silent. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm gonna choose the option that I was positioned and purpose for. And it says, so Mordecai went away and carried out all Esther's instructions. Okay. Now, as Esther begins to rise, she does not succumb to the opposition. Now, this opposition is pushing her to the king because that was the next result. The opposition that came, it ain't sent her to like, oh, woe is me, and I don't know what to do. And no, it pushed her where? To the king, because that's who she had to go see. So when opposition is happening, it's really pushing one to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, because that's now who I gotta go talk to. There's nobody else that I could go talk to. I gotta go. I have to now. I was summoned, and I gotta go now talk to the king. That's the part. That's the result of that. So Esther, we see her begin to practice that, right? Because now she's still practicing, she's still growing and maturing and rising in this movement as she continues to move forward. So the first way, or the first where we see this rise in authority is in Esther 5 verse 1, and it says, on the third day, right? So after the fasting, she puts on her royal robe, and then she went and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. She went right to the king with her royal robe, because now, okay, in my position of authority that you gave me, I'm gonna put on my royal robe, I'm the carrier of favor, I'm gonna move in by faith now, right? That opposition now is activating her faith, because by faith and belief, right, and trust, I gotta believe that you put me here for a reason, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna move in it. She goes stand before the king. So in her going and standing before the king, this is where I call it, this was the practice banquet that Esther had, because we know she called for more than one. So here she's standing before the king, and he's like, Esther, what do you want? And imagine that response, right? And how opposition don't get lost in the distortion of it. Because see, the king was waiting for her. Because he didn't say, what you here? What you doing here? What? He didn't even tell her, you're not supposed to do this. This ain't the culture. He ain't say none of that, right? Because in her function and her being a carrier of favor, it says, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her. That was his initial thing. He ain't think nothing about them laws. He ain't regurgitate no law, no nothing. It said when he saw, verse 2, Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So all that opposition that had to happen, and again, because we can apply this in our co-laboring relationship with the Father, how sometimes we can, that opposition to come in, and as we just learned, it can kind of make one think, I'm not supposed to do this. Maybe I shouldn't do this. And the King of Kings is like, I was pleased. I was waiting for you. I was sitting here. Okay, here, I'm holding out my scepter. Because then he say, what is your request? Then the king asks, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. And in my study time, that statement, when a king would say that, that was such a remarkable, amount of favor. It was one of those things that was saying, listen, whatever you about to ask me is going to be granted. That wasn't a kind of cliche statement. That was it wasn't just said to everybody. This was a very remarkable statement for the king to say to somebody, ask me up to half of my kingdom and I'm gonna go ahead and give this to you. So again, opposition has created this opportune time for the function of Queen Esther to stand before the king. So in this, and just to scroll down a little bit, So her initial request was, if it pleases the king, Esther said, let the king come together with Haman and come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the first banquet have, and like I said, I saw this as like a practice banquet, because what we see what happened is so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to have the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. And in the study again, because here we do see Esther didn't make the request at that time. So as I was sitting with Esther and in the study, it's like, because that's where we have to give ourselves grace when we are rising in the purpose, because she was still moving forward. Now, I'm sure she's still having this internal conflict. Like, listen, this a lot to take in now. I'm at the table, and now I got to make a request. I might need a little bit more time. I'm gonna do it, and I'm still moving forward, because she was still moving forward in this. Now she like, okay, come back tomorrow, and I'm gonna say it tomorrow. And in chapter 7, we do see that, right? Just to summarize that the part of beginning of chapter 7, we do see that about time this second banquet comes, Esther's like, okay, for real this time. For real this time, my petition is, there's an external opposition that has occurred, and it was brought to my attention. And now that it was brought to my attention, we got to do something about this. And we see now that rise in authority, because Esther doesn't now respond out of like, oh, the culture and all these other things that she's saying. No, it's an exposure of, well, guess what? I'm Jewish too. And these are my people now. There's a taking on and an ownership, and the release of, again, what was hidden has now come to the forefront. And now that is what is worn and stood in. So that's what we see happen at that second banquet of, okay, well, no, king, now for real. My request is, I need to save my people. And I'm also going to expose that external opposition, because opposition also creates an opportune time for exposure. So that's exposure of things externally. That's an exposure of things happening internally, right? It creates the exposure. And the thing about exposure is, again, it still brings things into alignment, because her internal exposure of cultural indoctrination and things like that, well, that was exposed. So now, okay, we can deal with that. And now you can become aligned even the more of your purpose. The external exposure, the plots and schemes was, well, now that exposes the why. Remember, we learned the why that was in the background had to come to the foreground. Well, now it exposes why I've even positioned you somewhere. Because sometimes opposition can cause one to get into that kind of spiral too. I don't know what's happening. Why is this going on? Why is this happening? Well, the opportune time has to come for the exposure too, for the function to meet. It brings that exposure for the why to make sense. And that's part of that opposition too, because sometimes the opposition, you just gotta wait. And it's not always uncomfortable, but you gotta wait for the exposure, because another part in between that first and second banquet in your own time, where you could go back and refresh yourself, is where there was a time of Mordecai being honored, but then even after that, there was a period where after Haman left that first banquet, he just look at Mordecai and he's still mad. And one of the things that he does is he sets up a poll to have Mordecai impelled on. And I do want to just put that out there, because we're going to see how that ties into the resolve. But in that in between time, there was still a buildup of that external opposition that still had to set the stage. That's the point of saying that. There still was a setting of a stage. So again, part of the opposition was there was a wait period. And it just had to be that. Now, if we look in chapter 8, this is where, as we're learning, there comes a time in their opposition one chooses to rise in, right? It's that you begin to practice. And now we saw Esther begin to speak out of her authority, because the initial opposition, it did come after her voice. Because it was, if you remain silent, that was a choice she had to make. That was part of the conflict, that choice. Do I keep silent? Do I now begin to say something? Because the first thing that she started speaking was out of something that didn't belong to her. It was out of a cultural thing that was placed inside of her. But then once she started to practice and utilize her authority that she was in, then she started to speak from a place of authority. And when we look at chapter 8, we're going to see that as Esther continued to rise, there were certain things now that produced from this opportune time that was still producing. There was new territory. And then also, because the territory had to do with the co-laboring relationship, one thing I do want to point out, that when we see that exchange between Mordecai and Esther, another thing that we can learn about what could be a potential effect of misunderstanding opposition, it could have affected their co-laboring relationship, right? If there wasn't an understanding of the importance of that, like, or the necessity of that opposition, and even why Mordecai wasn't responding, because he wasn't saying, like, oh, I understand and I get it, wasn't time for, like, the pacifying and things like that, right? So in that, there could have been a miscommunication or a misunderstanding that could have affected that co-laboring relationship. And the reason why we want to take note of that as scholars is because, again, in our co-laboring relationship, in our walk and just our roles and our functions and things like that, is it is co-laboring. That's the emphasis. So if there is one area or one side that isn't aligned or isn't understanding why a particular thing may be happening, or allowing that thing to mature them and push them into alignment, well, what would have happened? Because Mordecai, again, while he was a official with the king, he knew, I can't do this by myself. I need to do this with you. That's why he sent word to Esther. It never was, oh, he went and tried to do it himself, but it didn't work out. That's not what we read. I don't have that in my Bible, right? We read that it says he immediately depended on his co-laboring relationship. So if there wasn't that rise through that internal relationship, right? Because that couldn't have just been, swiped over or prayed away and all that. No, it had to serve a purpose to align you. And if that was misunderstood, it could have potentially affected that resolve and that response. So I want to say that because now when we look at chapter 8 and chapter 9, we see what became the resolve because Esther rose, because she didn't succumb to the opposition. She tapped into her authority. And one of the first things that we see immediately in Esther chapter 8 is, it says, the same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king. For Esther had told him for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman. Because again, in order for those decrees to go out from the king, they would be signed by the signet ring, which this is what attached and connected it to the king. So that's another significant piece because Haman was the one who had it. But now, and that exposure of that opposition that was happening, and now that the purpose of everything is coming to play, well, we're going to take that signet ring back. And that signet ring of the king, well, now guess who it belonged to? Esther and Mordecai. right? So now it said this the signet ring, um it the signet ring which he had reclaimed from Haman and presented to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So now we're gaining territory. There's territory that's being acclaimed. And continuing on, Esther continues to speak because now she has more things that she's asking for. I don't want just Haman dealt with. Okay, he was dealt with. That first part of that external opposition that was dealt with, but that's not the resolve. And those are two different things, right? Haman was dealt with, but now I gotta keep speaking until I get the resolve. So now the resolve is, it says Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. And I just love that because it says, she was weeping and begging and at his feet, but he essentially was like, Esther, you don't got to do all that, stand up. Right, because she got up and it says she stood before him. And I just think that's a beautiful notation in the scripture because now it goes, she says, all right, if it please the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor, being the carrier of favor that I am, and thinks it's right to do the thing, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, the son of Hamagatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews and all of the king province. Because now I'm speaking of resolve. Um, and that's what we see, right? And when he replies to her, he says, because Haman attacked the Jews, I gave his estate to Esther, and they upheld Haman on the pole that he set up for Mordecai. And now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as it seems best to you. Because I know you asking me, but you speak, you and your authority, you write the decree. Y'all do it on behalf of your people. Because you want to know better than I am. Because what was the decree? So because the decree that was written, and just to paraphrase the decree, what they end up writing was it gave the Jewish people a right to now defend themselves. And that was the major difference because the initial decree that went out, that's why I keep saying genocide. It was like a genocide because it really was just an order of execution. Go out. When you see the Jewish people, kill them where they stand. Them, their women, their kids, just kill them. That's all that it was going to be. So now here the king is saying, well, you know the best course of action. What do y'all need in order for this? Because what was written, it can't be changed, but you can bring a resolve, right? How do you rectify this? Well, the resolve in order to rectify it was, well, now I'm gonna give these people the right to defend themselves. So when the enemy come, they're not just going to stand here. This is not just going to be an execution order. Now it's going to be you, your household, anything you could grab your hand on. When you see them coming and they come to take your life, fight, kill. So that's what we see. That was the resolve. And it says it in verse 11. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. Um, if we go now to chapter 9, so now we're continuing again. We're seeing the resolve. We're seeing the gaining of territory. We see the movement of this co-laboring relationship. But another thing that we're also seeing Esther is growing more in her boldness. She's growing more in her confidence. That's why I said I love that account where the king, she stand back up, right? Because now she's growing in her confidence of even speaking before the king. And as we see in verse 9, we also see some cultural things that are now added into the Jewish people. In the very same place where there was cultural opposition and internal opposition and external opposition, it becomes a place of celebration. It becomes a place of joy. It becomes a place of new territory. So I want to read through chapter 9 because we're going to just see those different things. We also see how at this point Esther continued to speak because when we read the word we can see like, oh, okay, she spoke at the banquet, or oh, okay, she spoke at the for the decree, but Esther did more speaking after that too. So let's look and we're going to read through chapter 9. It says, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but they didn't, because now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the province, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators, they helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Okay, again, we're seeing how this resolved, that authority, that alignment of the co-laboring, all that opposition that had to come, it pushed and created this resolve. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with swords, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. We see this shift, right? That same external opposition that was against them, when it was shifted, because now they got the upper hand. Now they're the ones that's in the authority. Now they're the ones in control, right? This is the purpose that God was still moving. Again, that's the point. The opposition was part of the narrative because there still was a purpose that the Father was moving. I'm gonna skip down a little bit. In verse 11, it said the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will be granted. So what did Esther, as she continues to speak, and now she's in her boldness, her confidence of authority, she still got more to say. The resolve happened, but now she's like, okay, well, let's have the abundance of this resolve. So she says, if it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also. And let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. So I know we already have the resolve of the initial edict went out, and the Jews now, my people were able to defend themselves. But you know what? If you're asking me, do I have more to petition and to say? I absolutely do now. Now I want them to be able to do it another day. And I also want the sons of Haman to be impaled as well. Because that is what is so looking at this now came from Esther. She wasn't talking to Mordecai. She wasn't talking to nobody else at this point. It's saying her and the king is now having this conversation. So Esther done rose to a place in her authority. She done rose to a place in her intercession, in her advocacy, in her co-laboring relationship, to where now, while she is still one in her co-laboring relationship, she's also matured in independence enough to know, I'm going to say this, I can speak this. If I was to happen to be talking to Mordecai, what would he say? Because now she has matured where this is what she say. Well, let's do this another day and then give me the sons of Haman and Pelham. So that's amazing where we see that again, that transition where it went from internal opposition. She had to have some self-confrontation, some things had to be dealt with, right? It had to be let go. Then she was raw. She had to practice a little bit. She had to practice banquet. She started speaking. She was building her confidence. And now she came the resolve. She's still gaining territory. She brought Mordecai into the presence of the king. Now they have the signet ring. And now, now after that is a resolve, a decree went out, and now it's her and the king having a conversation in confidence now, in boldness. Okay, well, I want this too. And that's what happened. It says, so the king commanded that this be done. And that's the beauty of seeing that response in the standing and the authority and in moving and growing and maturing, where the king was responding according to her, right? The king was responding according to the authority that was inside of Esther, the purpose that father was moving inside of Esther. It was as if he ain't have another choice but to do it because it was in alignment. That's why that opposition is useful because it's bringing the alignment. Little prequel, because you got to yield in that place, right? So it's bringing that alignment so that the purpose, it becomes inevitable. It's the opportune time, the appointed time is inevitable as long as the alignment remains. And just quickly before I read your questions, I just want to skip down to where we see Purim established, right? And Purim is the Jewish celebration, right? They went into after the resolve and they defended themselves against those who were coming to attack them. Purim became a cultural, a generation. It was written. It was written that Purim is something to be celebrated generation after generation after generation. Don't forget this. Keep celebrating the day that came where the enemy thought he was going to take y'all out, but you didn't, and you rose. Continue to celebrate that. But what Esther would like us to know is she had to do with this. It says, these days, now I'm at verse 28. It says, these days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. So again, in all of what was that opposition internally, externally, and the cultural opposition, it shifted to now this place where we see the boldness, the authority, the confidence, new territory, places of celebration. And we see how Esther had a lot of speaking that she was saying, even beyond the banquet and the decree, but she also had to do with the speaking of celebration and remembering what happened. That is and we continue to see that highlight of that co-laboring relationship with her and Mordecai that's threading throughout this entire account. So your questions that you could reflect on, and again, that you have two options of your reflection questions. So after what we've learned in this course, the first one is, how has your perspective of opposition changed due to the teaching of this course? Or you can answer, identify an area in your life, internal or external, where you were facing opposition and reflect on how it can be pushing you for potential purpose. So as always, I pray that you were elevated because of the teachings, that you do now have a newfound perspective of opposition, that you have found encouragement because of the teaching that Esther so graciously, mighty, and powerfully gave us tonight on opposition. And I pray you all are blessed and continue to study and reflect on your questions. Good night.